I'll introduce myself a little bit more in just a sec, but really the goal of tonight, one of the goals is to learn about the parts of a flower. Because in order to do anything with botany, or to learn plants, or to key out plants, you've got to know the parts of a flower. And that kind of goes with this book. I highly recommend you owning these books. It's just a little, Janet Wingate is a local botanist here in Colorado. She wrote this book. And then Jack Carter, this is actually the older edition, but it doesn't matter. It's just as good, I think, as the newer edition. Both these books are books I recommend that you own if you're interested in plants and learning about plants for the rest of your life. What was the first one? The first one is Rocky Mountain Flower Finder. And it's, she also has one for the alpine, I think. This is, I think, this would say below tree line, down below tree line. She has one for above tree line too, if you like getting up in the high country, which is really fun too. But anyway, so really our goal tonight is to learn about the parts of a flower, and then to learn specifically here in Chatfield, several of the plants that grow here and are currently dormant, so we can't go out and check them out because it's dark. But we have them kind of dried in a box. And then we're going to talk a little bit about gymnosperms. There's juniper here at Chatfield. So, I mean, if you go across the street and hike up Waterton just a little ways, you're going to see ponderosa pine, juniper, and probably a leaf spruce eventually. So that's, and also Douglas firs. So we'll talk about those a little bit, and just the differences between flowering plants and gymnosperms, which are cone-bearing plants, trees, pine trees. We'll talk a little bit about that. And then we'll also talk, we're actually not going to talk a whole lot about keystone species. There's a whole, keystone species is a super important topic. And for me, as a, mostly I've heard in Colorado that there's animals that are keystone species. But I know that in Arizona there's keystone plant species. It's just that here I was really struggling with that concept with plants. And we can talk about it a little bit if we have time, but probably not. And then we're going to talk about invasive plants, so basically weeds, and then noxious weeds, and what the difference is, and then a couple of them. There's a lot of weeds here in Chatfield, so if you guys want, you can learn all the weeds you wanted to. I think you've got every noxious weed on the state list. So, which isn't, you know, that's pretty common. There's a lot of weeds out there. So, and that's kind of, and then we're going to do a hands-on. You're just going to try to figure out what some of these plants are using this book. Because we can't really do flowers this book because they're just not happening right now. So I first got into plants a long time ago when I worked in Yosemite. I grew up in California, the Bay Area, and I worked in Yosemite Institute as a, they called us naturalists or environmental educators back then in the early 90s, which I can't believe it's so long ago now, but it is. And I just got really into plants. Before that, I lived in Steamboat for like 6 years, and then I was a ski bum, but I would just hike in the summer and just be enthralled with, you know. And at that point, I was just sort of beginning to say, yeah, I want to learn this stuff. I want to know what their names are, what this is. And that, I just sort of, from then, that was in the mid-'80s. Then I moved back to Yosemite for 4 years. And I took an ethnobotany class with this woman named Kat Anderson, and she's pretty much one of the best ethnobotanists. So ethnobotany is the study of plant uses by Native American people. And I really got into that when I was in Yosemite Valley. There are still Native people there in California that live and practice the Native ways. So I developed a program for kids that was all about plant uses. We would start fire on stage, and it was so cool. You know, tons of fun, cool stuff. So that was kind of my beginnings. And then I just sort of, it evolved, and I went back to grad school eventually and got a degree in biology, and then I studied a rare plant. I did a research thesis on a rare plant in pollination biology. So it's really kind of eclectic. But it's all about plants. I love plants. So I think that's pretty much it about me. Do we want to go around the room and say names really fast, or do we not have time for that?
It's up to you guys. We have name tags.
Yeah, name tags are great. If you guys are good with that, okay, that's fine. Okay, so the definition of botany, let's just go forward and see what we have here. So we'll stop here for just a sec. So I kind of talked about this a little bit, botany and why it's so great. It's just such a great subject. And plus, plants are sort of the foundation in any ecosystem. I mean, if you learn ecology, and you guys are going to have an ecologist do a talk here or something, they talk about that whole energy flow and how plants are sort of the foundation of any kind of ecosystem. So that's another reason it's so great. And so also, well, let's see, go forward one more and see what we have. Hang on a second. Okay. So the study of botany is basically a branch of biology, biological studies, and it's the study of living plants. So that's really it. Emily wanted me to mention just what a definition of botany. Okay, so let's move forward. I talked about everything there, and let's dig into our flowers.
Yay!
Yeah. So some of the most magical adventures I have had are simply sitting in one place and keying out a flower out in the wild. When you use a hand lens, you guys should all have a hand lens there at your desk, and you can get them like this as well. This is a great one. I recommend this too if you want to get into plants. But I swear, some of the best adventures are just sitting there for an hour with a flower and looking at the parts up close. It's just the most amazing, fascinating, beautiful thing to do. You don't even have to spend money or travel. You can just hike on a trail up here and, you know, sit down and adventure away into a microscopic world. So it's pretty awesome. So flowers, now what you guys have here at the tables is a flower that came from a nursery. So this flower has been manipulated. There's genetic modification that's gone on with these flowers. So when we talk about angiosperms, and there's a huge bunch of notes that I gave you on the PowerPoint for this slide, probably too many, but when we talk about flowers on planet Earth, it's flowers, angiosperms is a division. When you talk about botany, it's a huge segment of separation. So you have flowers, and then you can divide flowers into two types. And there's monocots, and there's dicots. And I think that's written down on your sheet there. So monocots, lilies are monocots. And one of the ways you can tell a monocot is its parts come in threes. So if you count the petals of these flowers, you should get a multiple of 3. And if you see an avalanche lily, if you go hike the trail up on 4th of July trail up there out of Boulder, and you come upon an avalanche lily in July, there'll be 6 petals. So lilies always come in parts of 3s. So if you count the parts in here that look alike, these parts, there should be parts of 3 of those as well. The other thing that you'll notice with monocots is the veins are parallel to each other. So you can put these up to the light, the leaves, and you can see that the veins of the leaves run parallel to each other. They're not netted. Does everybody see that? Okay, so think of corn. Corn is a
I heard something else.
What did I say? Something bad? Corn.
Parts of 3.
Corn.
That's the point.
We're not going there right now. So if you think of corn, that eats corn, and grasses are monocots. Grasses are flowers. They're monocots. The flowers on the grass are so tiny they're hard to see, but they're there. So these are our monocots. Huge division. So orchids are monocots. What else can we think of that's a monocot? Lilies, orchids, grasses, corn, all that. Okay, and then dicots have parts that are not in 3s. They're either in 2s. You might have 5 petals, typically, on a dicot. So like a geranium is a dicot. And if you look at the leaves, it's a netted, branched venation. It's not parallel, okay? So two huge categories for flowers. And we have both here at Chatfield. There's monocots and there's dicots. There's tons of grasses, so there's tons of monocots here at Chatfield. Okay.
So are all grasses monocots?
All grasses are monocots. Yep. Alrighty, so let's start looking at this flower. So flowers, and I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on this because when we do this in July, we'll have real flowers out there and really get into it. But what they call flowers come in whorls. So, and sadly with these lilies, they're missing the first whorl. The first whorl, so what you do is you have like this is the outermost whorl. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that would be the sepals. So sadly you guys don't get to see sepals because on these flowers, it's a combination of the petals and the sepals. They're all combined. So if we look at this, you can kind of see they're sort of green down here. If we were to see sepals, it'd be just like another set of leaves. It looks like green petals around the base of.
It's when it's at the back of the rose. You know, if you got a rose and
Yeah,
those little
yeah.
things that look like tiny petals or tiny leaves.
Exactly.
The green undercut. The green undercut, yes.
Exactly. So for your lily here, your monocot lily, these are the petals and the sepals together, and they have a name for that. They call it tepals, but you know, for your sake right now, don't worry about it. There's, you know, we'll just call these tepals, but they're really just petals. There are sometimes when you're out in the field, like there are tiger lilies that are native out there, and if you were keying it out, in the key she does talk about it as tepals or it has, so you may, if you get really into this, you may come across that. Okay, so that's the first outer whorl on the sepals. And then as we move in, we get to the petals. So this is in cross section, so if you were to cut it across and look down on it. So then these would be the petals, but for ours tonight, they're combined, and they're called tepals. Okay, so then when we move in even further, we get into reproductive parts. And the next whorl in are the anthers. They're the male reproductive parts. So you can feel free to pull these things apart. So these here, there's 6 of them, are the male reproductive part, and the pollen is formed on the end of those. Actually, these are the anthers. The whole thing is a stamen. And up to that point is called a filament. So sometimes in flowers, like in geraniums, at the base, they're all fused together. So these come in so many different shapes and styles, and just we call it morphology, just all these different ways of being. So go ahead and you can look close with your lenses and look and see if you can see the pollen grains. Close, little tiny dusty things. So these are that's the male reproductive part.
And that whole thing's called a stamen, right? The entire.
The whole thing's a stamen, and on the end is the anther. Yeah, it produces the pollen. So the pollen is the male. It's like the sperm in humans. And actually there is a sperm cell within that pollen that does happen within this whole reproductive cycle. Then as you go in, even into the middle, even more of this flower, you'll see in the center is the female part. And we have that labeled as, so the long stem on that is called the style, and then the top is a stigma. And see how it's 3-lobed on the top? You can use a hand lens and see the 3 lobes. So that's another 3-parted thing with a monocot. They come in parts of 3s. Super cool. So sometimes with 3rd graders, we refer to that little tip as the sticky stigma queen. When I used to work up at the Nature Center, and we had a wildflower program for 3rd graders, because 3rd grade is one of the standards for learning parts of the flower. So you guys probably work a lot with 3rd graders. So this is great stuff if you can teach them the parts of the flower in the summertime again. Okay, so that's another name for that center part. So the whole thing together is called the pistil, which includes the ovary, which is at the base. And you can actually kind of dig into that and break it apart, and you'll see the ovules on the inside of the base. So you can just pull the tepals off, the petals and sepals combine, and at the base, you'll see it's kind of swollen. So that's where the seeds are going to form. So the pollen is going to get transported to the tip of that stigma that's sticky, and then it sends down a sperm cell that actually grows a tube. There's 2 cells in it. There's a tube that grows, and then the other cell swims down, and that's when it gets at the bottom, and then the seeds form from that. So,
say that one more time.
the ovules. So the pollen
Yep.
gets transported with the insects and gets deposited on the tip of the, right there,
The
the stigma.
Okay.
And then then that's pollination. And so then what happens is 2 cells form. One forms a tube that the other one swims down. It's crazy stuff. We could go on forever with this. And then it swims down and fertilizes the egg at the bottom. And that's how the seeds get fertilized. Yeah, so then you have ovules in there. It's on that picture here. And then they form seeds at the bottom. So then you'll always have like 6 seeds, or it'll be in groups of 3s again, because it's monocot. Okay,
So
so,
for a fruiting plant, is
yeah.
that's where the fruits come from?
Yeah, so the whole thing is the fruits. Yeah. So the whole thing of an apple is the fruits, and then the ovules are on the inside. Those are the seeds. So if we slice that ovary at the bottom, you can see a cross section like in your picture there. You can see those ovaries in there, but we don't have time to do all that. So
You can go home and do it on your own and bring this home with you.
yeah, you're welcome to just pick those flowers or have fun with it at home by your own lily. Okay, so that's pretty much it with, you have anything you want to add with flowers?
No, do you guys have any questions at all? Just to kind of.
Yeah, you can just keep it.
Yeah.
I learned in a class that remember the style is the female part because women have more style.
Ah,
And
that's
so
good.
that's like and the ovary is in there, and so.
Nice, I like it. Yeah. And there's more words on here too. They've got andrecium for the male part, which is the collection of the anther and the filament. So that whole thing, it's just more scientific. And gynecium for the female. The whole gynecium is synonymous with pistil. There's just, science always has too many words. And then all the petals together are called the corolla. So we go to corolla. And then all the sepals together, like those green sepals at the base of the rose, are all called a calyx. And you're going to see these words, you'll see these words in this book when you're trying to key out plants. But it's a limited amount of words, believe me. You can do it. You can master it. Okay, so I'm probably over time already.
No, you're actually doing pretty good.
Okay.
Were there any other questions on before she was here?
Okay, so that's our flower. And really that pertains every flower on this planet. If you guys travel down to the tropics, or if you go to Hawaii, or every flower, you're going to find those parts in the flower. So it's pretty cool. It's universal, and there's monocots and dicots everywhere too. I think there's more monocots when you go to the tropics.
Do any like indigenous tribes use this for like makeup or coloring? Because it's got a really cool color.
Yeah,
It's
and
like
you
a fluorescent
know they take them
yellow.
off sometimes when you
Yeah.
find lilies so it doesn't stain.
Yeah.
I'm sure they do.
That's
I don't know
cool.
for sure, but yeah. Okay, so now what we're going to do is just go through about 10 different plants that you see out here in Chatfield. And I'm gonna, you guys can chime in if you have comments about these plants or whatever. So the really neat thing about botany and biology in general is things are categorized. So, you know, family, kingdom, that whole thing, division, there's, what was the classification? Yeah, the whole classification system. So really the key, if you really want to learn plants, the key to it is learning your families. Names tonight, they're going to all be pretty much just common names. But really the key is to learn the family. So the cactus has its own family. And Colorado is blessed with beautiful cacti. There are just wonderful cactus species from the west slope to the east slope to way up high in the mountains. And the cactus are really beautiful. And prickly pear cactus is one that you'll see out here at Chatfield. A lot of times if you go to an area, right now I'm working so that I do tons of field work, and I'll go out and there'll be an excess amount of prickly pear. Like it's just everywhere. You can barely walk without stepping on it. Have you ever had that, like out on the... So that's a sign that there's been too much grazing. So there's sometimes you'll get too much of this. These are quite adaptable plants. They do well, and if other things have been taken away, they start to take over. So if you just see a lot of it, it can be a sign that it's not necessarily a good thing.
There's a question.
Yeah.
I often see the yellow and purple blossoms in the same area.
Mhm.
Do they ever cross
Oh,
pollinate?
that's such a good question. I've always wondered that myself. They consider it the same species, so I bet they do cross-pollinate, but I don't know the answer for sure to that.
There must be a dominant one of the two, because you never see like a real pale purple or...
You
Or
don't.
a
You see
pink.
either dark pink or, and I almost stuck in another slide with that beautiful pink blossom. For me, I see the pink ones more out on the eastern plains than I do here on the foothills, close to the foothills. Because, yeah, here I don't think, have you ever seen a pink one at Chatfield? Yeah, so they are considered the same species. It's really pretty. So, any questions about the cactus? You know, you can eat, I've got a jar of prickly pear cactus at home that a friend made for me from the fruit. I've seen coyote scat that is just pure cactus fruit with the spines still on it. And like, I've stared at that poop for a while and just went, oh my heavens, that went through the whole tract and he pooped out spines. Like, wow, it's cool. Pretty amazing. That was way out by Sterling, way on the plains. So they're chowing on those cactus fruit, those coyotes.
Do you know if the prickly pear we have here, so this looks very similar to the stuff in Arizona that I saw, but here I see pads that are much, much smaller and have way more spines.
Yeah.
Are those still prickly pear? or
Those are
just
actually
nuts?
characteristics of keying the species out. So some of the species have spines that are closer together on the pad itself.
Okay.
So this actually is the stem of a cactus. Cactus are so cool, they're adapted to dry. And Emily's done a lot of work in Arizona, so she's seen all kinds of cacti. But these are the leaves. The spines are modified leaves on a cactus. Yeah, you could go on and on. Evolutionarily, it's a pretty old flower. So older flowers have a lot more parts. So you'll see, like we counted 6 male parts on these flowers. They'll have, hundreds. You can see them in here. When you look at a cactus flower, there's hundreds and hundreds of stamens and anthers. So that's sort of an older evolutionary model, so to speak.
So then what is the part that when you say the fruit, what is the part? The whole leaf is the...
No, so the fruit, this is the flower, and then in the middle there's a stigma, sticky stigma, and bees will come in, these are bee pollinated, so you'll see them crawling all over these stamens, the male, or the anthers, and then they'll get some of that pollen from another flower or another plant on that stigma, and then that's how it gets pollinated, and then the fruit starts to develop. So the fruit actually are fully developed in late August, September. You'll see bright red fruit on the cactus plants. And you can eat them.
It's where prickly pear juice comes from, or if you've ever had a prickly pear margarita.
Okay. There's prickly pear tea now, too.
There's tea.
Yeah, they make great preserves.
Yeah,
too.
jam, jellies, we have.
Yeah. So there's so much fun stuff you could do with kids and cactus. Yeah.
With the cactus, is it the same as other flowers where they need another cactus? Can a flower self-pollinate, or
Yeah.
do you need another one?
So that's a great question that Emily's asking, and every species is different. Most plants need to cross-pollinate, so they need to get pollen from an entirely different plant, right? So and that makes it more diverse genetically. So, but some plants self-pollinate, like pussy toads, that plant, I can't, it grows here, anyway, what? But it's a clone, so it self-pollinates, actually, it doesn't even need to pollinate, it'll grow a clone of itself. But for the most part, to answer that question, Emily, most of the flowers need cross-pollination. They need to get pollen from a different plant. Some plants have adapted to self-pollination. So the pollen will, from the same flower, will pollinate that plant. But that's not very common.
Isn't that a facilitated parsing by the difference in the height of the stamen?
Say again?
Stamens and the part.
And stigma? Huh?
Yeah, right. It's the different height of, you look at in here.
Yep, some flowers have a different height of stamens and the stigma, and that makes it so that it's harder to self-pollinate. And then sometimes, like with penstemon, see how I start talking? And
No, that's okay. Actually, we have lots of penstemon in our hummingbird garden, so this
Okay.
is important.
So with penstemon, what happens is the pollen matures on the flower itself. The pollen matures first, and then the stigma matures after the pollen is gone out of that flower. So that is a way to prevent self-pollination. It's such a good question. So it's super cool, and I did a ton of that with my research and my pollination biology stuff, we tried to figure out if this plant could self-pollinate. So you have to put nets around it to keep the bees out, and then see if viable seeds form later in the season. And it couldn't self-pollinate. That's what it came down to, which is what I pretty much figured, but you gotta do it all. So, yeah, so unknown with cactus if it'll self-pollinate or not. I don't know for sure.
Any other questions?
And if I missed something that I've written there and you wanna, yeah, there's cholla cactus. It's considered a shrub. Yeah, if you get to Colorado Springs, you start seeing cholla, which they get really tall. So above
Are they the ones that are all marly?
And they're long and narrow pieces. They look like
and the old, it's not actually wood, but the old plant parts are really neat looking.
totally woody.
Okay, so yucca. Yucca glauca is a species that is here out in Chatfield. Wonderful plant. I wish it was June right now and we were walking out there amongst the blooms. Really cool plant. It's another plant that can be an increaser if there's been too much grazing, because it's pretty adaptable to this climate. And but it's got a really fascinating pollination process. So in the West, Colorado, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, into California, there's about 40 different species of yucca. And here in Colorado, we have 2 or 3, I think, different species of yucca. But for every species of yucca, there is a different species of moth that pollinates it. And the way they found that out was they tried to introduce yucca in Europe, but they didn't have the moth. So it wasn't producing any seeds. Like it probably bloomed, they had the plant, but then it didn't produce seeds and it didn't spread. So anyway, I don't know which particular species of moth this is, I just found it online, but the story of the moth and how it pollinates is so freaking amazing. I mean, it's this life cycle that we could spend another 20 minutes on, but really quickly, the female moth gets a big ball of pollen and she holds it like under her chin and then flies to another plant and then stuffs the pollen onto the stigma and pushes it down kind of where it needs to be, and then lays her eggs in there. And then the eggs start to develop into larvae. This is a whole year cycle. And then the larva actually feeds as it's developing on some of that pollen ball that she had collected. And then as they get bigger, they feed on some of the seeds that develop. So it's a whole predator thing that keeps the yucca in balance. These moths, what they do is they keep down the number of seeds, right, so the plant doesn't get out of control. And plus, they pollinate the flower. So it's a symbiotic relationship. It's really incredible. I've never yet seen one of these moths, but people that I talk to say that they have. So, yeah.
I was gonna say that a lot of people plant them in the city and county, if you're inside the city, but they don't get fertilized, you rarely see them in the seed pipeline.
Yeah,
Just the bloom,
yeah.
just the bloom stuff.
I'm one of those that's like, oh, that got fertilized, it must have been moths, you know? And then you'll see places where there's no, it doesn't, and it's like, oh, there weren't any moths in that area. Yeah, it's a great observation. Once you know this cycle, it's like, wow, look at the seeds on that yucca. You know, there must have been great moth action there. So, and then the little moth managed to, you know, moths are like butterflies, they go through that whole metamorphosis. It manages to emerge right when the flowers are blooming. So they come together right in June, it's around June 10th, these things bloom, the whole thing, the cycle starts again.
June 10th.
About June 10th.
You want to plant yourself out by a yucca and take some
June
photographs of all this
I've
happening.
been watching.
11 o'clock in the
It
morning.
could be earlier now because the climate
That's
seems
right.
to be altering, you know? So yucca's a cool plant because oftentimes you'll see tons of aphid on yucca. Has anyone ever noticed that? Right. So aphid, they like explode the juice that they're taking from the plant and it comes out in a bubble on their back. And so then the ants farm them. They move them around the plant. So it's like this, the aphids like it because then the ants will move them to a place where there's more fluid to get. And the ants just feed on that bubble that's coming out of their back of juice. I guess it's like sugars and stuff that are coming out of the plant. And then you'll see tons of ladybugs on these yuccas that are eating the aphids. Deer love the flowers. It just goes on and on. So I was
It's a
thinking,
whole ecosystem in and of itself. So
It is.
that talk about ecology,
Yeah.
this is a micro ecosystem. So this is an example of that game you guys played last week on a much smaller scale, just in the yucca plant.
super cool. Just sit and look at a yucca plant for a while sometime. I mean, at first you'll go, oh, gross, there's so many aphids on that plant. But then you'll see like all these things going on. It's really cool. And then the plant itself too was used to make sandals for local native people wherever yucca grew. And I think they ate the fruit too. I don't really know how. They probably roasted it or something.
Yeah, the roots of it is what I've heard were.
Oh, so, yeah.
There's that piece, and then in Arizona they actually use the fibers of the yucca plant to weave diapers. They made diapers and clothing out of the yucca, the leaves of it actually.
Tons of uses. Okay. So poison ivy. So what is the little saying? 3 leaves. Has anyone had a bad case of poison ivy here?
Yeah.
I've had a bad case of poison oak.
Mine was oak
Yeah.
in California.
Which, they're different species, but they're the same genus, they're really related. Leaflets, 3, let it be, yeah. So, you know, it's all over here. It likes kind of moist environments, and the scary thing is in the winter, you don't see the leaves. So you can get it just as bad without the leaves. I got it once in California in the winter. Oh my God. It seemed to get systemic. I had it like in my mouth, and it was just the worst. But it's in the sumac family, which is, you know, pretty neat. We'd have to, I mean, to learn your families, you have to kind of learn what the flowers look like and the characteristics of that. But what's neat is that most of the sumac family plants are tropical. This is kind of a remnant of when it was warmer here. It's kind of cool, and you know, you could have some cashews for the kids to eat. Say, this is in the same family as the cashew family, and so they say that in the winter you'll see some places where there's just thick with white berries, and on the poison ivy. Has anyone noticed that? I would get near those white berries, but apparently birds eat them. And what is it? Did it say which birds? Just said birds. I don't know that there. But, and it's funny because I walk up in Red Rocks almost every day because I live over near there. And there's this one area where there's just so many white poison ivy berries. It doesn't look to me like anything's touched those berries all winter. So I don't know who eats those berries. But what else can we say about poison ivy? It's got leaflets. So each of these, this whole thing is actually technically a leaf. And then it's got 3 leaflets. So, any thoughts, questions on poison ivy? The flowers are really tiny. inconspicuous, hard to see. I'm not gonna get near a flower of poison ivy, but it is all over here. So, does anybody not know how to recognize it? It's fine if you don't. 'Cause
You will,
You
don't
will.
worry, it'll teach you.
probably an important one, I would
It's
say.
very, in the garden, which I think we all showed you on the day we gave you the tour, right at the very end of the outdoor lab classroom on the southwest end, there is a whole thing that grows right there that we show the kids before we go out. Well, sometimes we do try, but it's all over. I mean, it's everywhere out there, so I always point it out and show it to the kids because, the less that they're running around in it, the less likely they're going to get it.
There's another plant. Oh,
If
sorry.
it's not the leaves that causes the reaction, what part is it?
It must be something in it's the oil that gets in the branches too, and in the, I don't know, I would say.
Oh, the worst case I ever had of poison ivy was from the roots.
Oh,
Yes.
I was living in Kentucky and rototilling a new garden spot,
mhm.
and I didn't realize there had been poison ivy growing there. Tilled up the roots and just handling it.
Oh.
And like you said, with your mouth, eventually it got in my bloodstream and was everywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh.
do not burn it.
And then it would come in surges for me, like that time I got it bad. It would kind of go away like a breath and then flare up. It's awful. I was going to say something else about, yeah, I mean, plants all have different types of oils, terpenes, and there's a whole list of them that I memorized once from one of my science classes, and now, of course, I've forgotten them all. So, yeah, it's coming through the oils. Plants. All right, so grapes. There's grapes, lots of grapes here. And we were out there in early August, late July last summer, and we did see the developing grapes on the vines. So I don't know, I actually looked in Dr. Weber is the main plant guy here in Colorado. He's 94 years old. He's been here for a long time, but he wrote, there's a western slope and an eastern slope, and in his book it says,
Or is it on the table?
yeah, it's here. Western slopes here. I think I gave you eastern slope last year. But
Yes,
this is,
there's an eastern slope.
okay, so this is western slope, and it's Dr. Weber. He's still alive and kicking. He's way into bryophytes and mosses now. So like those little things that don't have roots. That's his big thing now. But anyway, he said that there's a cultivated grape, which could very likely be what's here. This used to be like, people were living here and they probably planted grapes. So the way to tell that in his book, this is western slope, so you want eastern slope, but he says that the leaves on the native ones are really shiny on the surface, and then the tendrils, it says black adhesive discs. I don't really know what that is, but we'd have to look at both and see. There must be little sticky discs on the end of the non-native grapes that we could find. So we can check that out when we head out there this summer. So, okay. Anyway, they're quite tasty, and it'll be fun to check and see if they're native or not.
The birds.
And one thing with grapes too, their leaves, see how it's like, it's called a simple leaf. It's not divided into fingers or anything. Leaves come in all shapes. So a palmate leaf has fingers. This is a simple leaf. So it's got like these oh God, I'll probably knock this a little bit. It's got these, dentations on the edges of the leaves, but it is still simple and whole. So the grape leaves are like that. So if you see something that you think is grape, but it's divided, then it's probably not grape. Because there's Virginia creeper out there, there's hops, there's something else. They all sort of look similar. It's tricky. The grapes have simple leaves.
I've been meeting with, people out here in Colorado, and they've often referred to wild Oregon grape on the trails. Is that the same thing? No?
Yeah, so Oregon grape is a common name for Mahonia, which is that's what the person behind me said. Mahonia is the genus, the Latin name for Oregon grape. And it grows all over in the understory. Kind of shaded under the oak in the foothills. I think there's
Just
Oregon.
low to the ground.
I think it's here.
Yep, it's around all year.
Yeah. It's in the bearberry family. Yeah, so it's not even,
And if you tasted the actual grapes, they're very, very bitter and very sour. In the Pacific Northwest, they used to use them to make wine, and they would steam with that. The wild grapes are actually really sweet.
they're good.
Yeah, and they're a much duller color, where in grape it's a different, and a different shape too. The grapes are actually a different shape. Good
Yeah.
question.
Any other great questions? Yeah, that is a really good question. And so cattail,
So when you're eating a grape, what are you eating? The whole flowering kind of structure concept?
so this is the fruits, and
Okay.
the ovules are on the inside. Those are
Okay.
the seeds, if you have seeds in a grape. Like when growing up, we always had seeds in a grape. Now there's no seeds.
Yeah.
So they modified them.
Okay.
It's been genetically altered so that they don't have seeds. But yeah, so this is the fruit. This would be the ovary in the flower,
Okay.
and then the ovules are the seeds.
Okay. And all the petals, all that's fallen away, and that's left. If you think of an apple, you look at the bottom, that's what's left of the sepals and the petals and everything, all that little crunchy brown stuff in the bottom of an apple. It's because everything's fallen away. It's harder to.
Yeah, and then you have like inferior ovaries and superior ovaries and strawberries where the whole, yeah, it gets, fruit, the whole science of fruit, how it forms is so cool.
But basically, when you're eating fruit, you're eating ovaries.
Yep, pretty much always, yeah, except strawberries, you're eating their receptacle.
And that's how the animal or the plant stores its sugars, right, in the fruit.
Yeah, well, with angiosperms, they're highly adapted compared to like gymnosperms, pine trees. So it's a seed within the ovary, so it's a protection around those seeds. With pine cones, with these things, the seeds are naked. Gymnosperm means naked seed.
Okay.
So I don't know if that helps, but it's more adapted. It's more highly adapted than a gymnosperm because it's got that protection around the seeds.
The fruit can first be squished by birds and animals.
Exactly. I
Yeah.
love smelling
Good
good pitch.
adaptation for the fruit.
Every time I touch these cones, I get a pitch on my
Sticky.
hand. All right, so cattails. There's lots of cattails out there in the wet parts of Chatfield. And I don't have a whole lot to say about cattails except they're super important in the wetland areas. Lots of birds depend on them. Gray-winged blackbirds depend on cattails in marshes for nesting, and marsh wrens and Virginia rails for sure. So you'll see, has everyone seen the cattails out there? It's a flowering plant. It's an angiosperm. So it's got little tiny flowers that are tiny, 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 but it has all these parts. And a lot of times what happens with these plants is that the flowers develop, the flowers are what we call imperfect. So you'll have male flowers separate from female flowers. These are perfect flowers because all the male and female parts are all together. But I think with cattails, and I don't know for sure, but we could probably find out if we looked it up. And they have names, monoecious and dioecious. I'll just say it right now. So monoecious is one home. So these flowers are monoecious. There's one home, mono, for the male and female parts. And then dioecious is two homes, where you've got male flowers in one home, female flowers in the other home.
So where on the cattail would the flowers?
So at this point, this is in late summer, fall, the fruit has formed. So, and the fruit is full of that fluffy, so that's for dispersal, so it's gonna get on the wind and
So
those.
the cattail is
You know, that's a good question. I think the whole thing is probably the fruit and then the seeds are in there. There's just probably a million seeds in one of these things. Yeah, I think. I mean, we have to look up the morphology of a cattail flower and see how it all works, because I don't know for sure. When you key these things out, when you're trying to figure them out in the field, because there's a few different species of these, it has to do with how the fruit develops. And I think that some of them have the male flowers on top, and then there's a space, and then the female is down here. Something like that. But I don't know cattails super well. It's something I need to learn, because I need to get better at the riparian stuff. But, okay. Any questions on cattails? I'm sure there was a lot of use. But,
Yeah, they talked about in my graduate classes, one of the things they talked about beds, you can actually eat the roots of a cattail plant. And that people used to take these big brown seed heads and they actually made like pancake batter out of it. They would take the seed heads. I would assume there's probably a lot of protein in those seeds, and they make a mixture and actually do that. I don't know if they did that here. Obviously, we're not in the Pacific Northwest, but that is something that we always talked about in grad school trying, and none of us ever did it. But we talked about it a lot. Talked about edible parts of a plant, and I had no idea. I've been around cattails my whole life and never heard that you could actually eat them. So if anybody wants to get into that, let me know about it. We'll try out
I saw it on a
pancakes.
survival thing.
Did you?
They're fun to play with.
Yeah.
I love making
Yeah,
all
they
those.
are. The kids love to take them and throw that fluff all over the place. So she has
They probably use
Just
the.
a comment, there are a pair of twins, craigheads, that work out of Montana, and they have one that we're talking about. Here in the Rocky Mountain area to the west coast.
That would be interesting. It would be interesting to find out what you could do.
Yeah. So grasses are a whole huge, we could do a whole 3-month course on, or more, 6-month course on grasses. Grasses are super fun. They're really beautiful, really adventurous when you key out a grass. I actually spent about 60 hours keying out grasses this fall for the first time in my life. And I, believe it or not, totally got into it. It was like, oh, yeah, I get to get up and go key out grasses. Because they're beautiful, and their parts, for the most part, we have hundreds of native grasses in Colorado. And their parts are so tiny that for many of the grasses, you can't just look at it and say, well, that's such and such. You pretty much have to take it home and get a microscope out. I mean, I don't know. If you were a grass specialist, I guess you could remember all those things, but I have maybe 20 or 30 of them that I know by just looking at them. So you have a lot of grasses here in Chatfield, and one of the grasses is blue grama. And I actually have blue grama right here. So you guys can take a look with your hand lens. So this is a state grass. I even know that I always want to say the Latin word, but I'm going to refrain. I won't say it.
I'm not trying to keep you from saying it. We just want to make
They're
sure
such beautiful
the
words.
children know what we call it.
And I only know some of them, you know.
The-
But some people, my kids call this eyelash grass.
That's good.
This came from my backyard.
Yeah.
Tell them the dirty words.
It's everywhere too. I mean, this is another species that, you guys know species. This is another grass that if you see too much of it, it's a signal that there's been too much grazing in the past. There's not too many places in Colorado where there hasn't been too much grazing. It's rare to come upon a nice, pristine, diverse field of grass. It's been chowed on. So,
We do have a lot of that actually.
Yeah.
Eyebrows.
I have it in the garden field.
Yeah. Yes, well, we tried to kill it with mulch, but we'll see.
We're trying to build
We
mulch.
tried to kill it with mulch, really.
And so grasses are either bunch grasses or they're what's called rhizomatous, like a Kentucky bluegrass is rhizomatous to your front yard, or whoever has a front yard with bluegrass. So that grows, underground roots will grow along and then more will pop up as it goes along. They're rhizomatous. But a lot of the native grasses are bunch grasses, so they don't spread by underground roots. And many of the native grasses are super important to butterflies. I learned this long ago when I worked at the Nature Center. So skipper butterflies are associated with native grasses. They lay their eggs on the leaves and the stems.
There's lots of skippers. Those are a lot of what you'll see here in the spring and summer.
So if you grow native grasses in your garden, you're helping the butterflies, which is a good thing. Any questions on blue grama or grasses in general? Grasses have tiny flowers and they're wind pollinated too. Chokecherry. So chokecherry is a flowering shrub, sometimes tree. Okay, so, we like to define things as humans. And so we have this definition for a shrub or a tree, and it's just a matter of how tall it is, really. And I don't even know what the number is. I think it's like 8 feet, maybe. Once it's taller than 8 feet, it's a tree. I don't really know. I think you may say in here. If somebody sees it, let me know. I always forget. But I know that I've seen choke cherry that like, wow, that's a tree. And then a lot of times they look shrubby. So it just kind of depends on where it's growing, how much water it gets, that kind of stuff. There's tons of flowers in this inflorescence. And I think it's either called a panicle or a raceme. So the way flowers grow on a stem is called an inflorescence. And then it has a name, which I think it's a panicle. Is that right?
I think it is down.
Panicle.
Standing up, it's a raceme.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's good. See, I learned something. And then the choke cherry developed in the fall. Here's Fox Elder bug. Let me see that bug. I feel like I'm in my house because it's like I'll find them in the weirdest places. And, it's crawling out of my ear. Because we have box elder trees around our house. But these berries are super important for the black bear in the fall. It's a big part of their diet. And this year, the cherries developed really fast, like in July, because there was just no water, you know. We had such a bad drought. So I felt so bad for the bears. I'm sure they went to bed hungry. What else can I say about choke cherry? Anything? I think, you'll see a lot of people gathering these, like at Bear Park and stuff, oftentimes Hispanic people, because it's in their background. Culturally, they make jam and pies and.
I do every year, and it's great syrup.
Oh, neat.
Yeah, we
should
take
bring
them,
some.
we take them along the irrigation canal where they're probably trees because they grow 12 to 15 feet high because they get so much water.
Mm-hmm.
And huge, juicy, tasty berries.
Are they sweet?
No, they're not sweet. You have to add a lot of sugar.
Yeah, they're not sweet.
No.
Yeah, but
There,
still.
there is sugar in them, undoubtedly, but to the bear, they probably taste sweet. To
Yeah.
us, they don't.
Yeah. It's great. All right, so rabbit brush, of course, is everywhere here. And I brought some rabbit brush with their galls. So this is kind of gall night. So they've got these, has everybody seen those white galls on rabbit brush? If you want, you can kind of dig into that and see what you find in there. There might be some really
I actually tore apart some balls this weekend.
living, loving.
Got some little larvae to
Did you?
develop. Yeah.
Very cool. I
Yeah.
haven't seen that yet.
It's not this kind, the ones that kind of look like a bud.
You-
You know, the brown ones that
When I was out
have
with the kids
the
this
furry
summer
around
in
it.
here, we found some
And
with,
it was
very
right
brilliant
smack
emerald
dab in
green,
the
very
center
shiny,
at the bottom.
green larvae.
The bug was actually, or the
Those are
larva?
larvae.
And
Yeah.
maybe about that
Larvae.
big.
No.
I'm not an entomologist, I don't know.
Okay,
Yeah.
this is a beautiful.
Come next
Cool.
week if we have, we can talk to you about it.
Did you save them?
No,
They'll probably know. You know, they're good with their bugs. So, yeah, now one thing I learned about these galls is that they stain red.
See, this is like cochineal.
Right. How do you say that?
They stain
And
red.
it's a thing in Arizona that covers the cacti.
Yes.
The Native Americans used it
Maybe
as a
it's
dye.
maybe it's the cactus gall, not the skull that stains red.
The cochineal does.
Yeah.
I've not had this one.
Yeah.
This doesn't have.
That doesn't have red coming out of it?
No.
Okay. Look at you go. You get that, girl.
Let us know if you find a larvae.
I'm a macro photographer, so.
Oh, cool. Okay, so rabbit brush is quite the plant. There's many different species of rabbit brush in Colorado, and then there's subspecies and there's varieties, and it gets tricky keying these things out. And for a lot of botanists, you want to key it all the way to subspecies, because a lot of these things are tract communities. They're rare plant communities that the Colorado National Heritage Program tracks. So it gets tricky. But this plant is like a fast food restaurant in late August for all kinds of pollinators. I mean, you'll see flies and moths and bees and beetles and I mean, just covered. And sometimes when the painted lady butterflies come through, not every year do they come through, but it
Here
is
we
a
go, here's a larvae in the center.
Oh, cool.
Oh, wow. Sorry, it's not bug, but
Is it moving?
It's a plant thing. Yeah, he moved a couple times. I might have.
It is bright green.
Yeah.
No, it's kind of like an aphid thing. Or
Isn't that cool?
Yeah, super cool.
We're gonna
You
break
can pass
our
it
around, so yeah, we can pass around right now, we can also look at it during break too.
Okay, 7th break or?
We'll just, we have just a couple more to finish.
Okay, okay. Okay, so anyway, these plants are in the sunflower family. And the really great thing about sunflowers is that a sunflower is a head with many, many, many flowers on it. So it's not just one flower, it's multiple flowers. But the thing about it is that it's this great, the way it's designed is it's like this great platform. We used to call it a landing platform that insects can just land on like an airplane and just pollinate, you know, get the nectar and the pollen out of dozens of flowers right there on the platform. So if you think of a big sunflower, you know, with all the sunflower seeds in it, each one of those was a flower. So if you're a bee, you're like, oh my God, I'm going for it. There's just like flowers all around me, and this is my fast food joint for the day, but it's actually nourishing.
This would be a good thing to shade in your garden.
Yeah, I can't hardly stop the rabbit brush from coming into my garden, but yeah, rabbit brush is a great thing, and then sunflowers as well. This was a sunflower that I took a picture of way in the southeast part of Colorado. So there's hundreds of different types of sunflowers. They're almost as diverse as grasses. Any questions on sunflowers? So cottonwood is one of the main species that grows here in Chatfield. I mean, if I had to say, I mean, it is an indicator species, we call that, for a riparian corridor, which is where water is in Colorado. You can always tell where the rivers are flowing, because you'll see, there's cottonwood over there, there must be a river or drainage or something. They're water-loving trees, and it's a deciduous tree. It's got flowers, angiosperms, and there's 3 different kinds, technically, of cottonwoods. And what you have here is mostly plains cottonwood, which you'll get to look at in this box. It's kind of shriveled up, but. And you also have narrow-leaf cottonwood, so, and they're in the willow family, by the way. So here's the plains cottonwood. So if you go way out east on the plains, this is what you see almost entirely. And then as you start to rise in elevation, like here at Chatfield, you start to see narrow-leaf cottonwood as well. But then there's a hybrid. So you get these leaves that look like a cross between the narrow leaves and the big plains leaves.
And we've got those.
You've got, I think you have all 3 here. Yeah, which is really cool.
We kind of do. We're having some issues.
Well, then I talked to a botanist today that said he thinks there's more hybridization that goes on. But once you cross these 2, they become sterile. So they no longer can, yeah. It's kind of like the horse and donkey thing.
Can a horse and a donkey make it become sterile?
Yeah, it's a mule.
So Jack has to first sterile.
But then they found one once. That wasn't sterile. That was big news in the science community.
So a horse and a donkey.
So these, there's probably more horse and donkeys at Chatfield once. There's wild horses and wild mules in Colorado. So these trees are super important for migrating birds, and birds in general, probably birds that overwinter. I mean, this is a huge habitat area for Swainson's hawks, come all the way from Argentina, and they nest in these trees. I mean, and then all the neotropical birds that come, all the warblers, and they come up in the spring. They're just loaded with those birds. So.
The interior of the adult or the large trees will get soft, and they're very easily penetrated by woodpeckers.
Oh, cool.
So they wind up what we call apartment complexes.
Yeah.
You'll find multiple species in these. Woodpeckers will grow into it. And then when they get larger, they will haul out. Great horned owls nest.
See, so I almost kind of think of keystone.
Yeah, this is
I
why we
mean,
do like a nurse.
Keystone species creates a structural, what do they call it? So that Yeah, so that it actually sculpts the area almost, like a prairie dog creates all those burrows, and burrow owls use them, and same with this tree. I mean, there's so many things that depend on it and use it.
I was gonna say, if you wanna see a really grove of that type, is Carson Nature Center. You just go north along there, there's a whole big area.
And I bet they're soft because there's so much water in them, those
These are old
trees.
and a lot of them are dead.
Yeah, and those standing snags are important for wildlife too, yeah. But I did a study over at Sheffield once and drilled to get the age of the cottonwoods. And there were times when I would be putting that drill in, which doesn't necessarily, water would just squirt out at me like this fountain. They're full of water, yeah. It's pretty wild. Okay, so they're in the, what did I say, the willow family?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. All right, box elders. So we've got box elder bugs crawling all over us. I think I stepped on one down there. There's one up here. I actually don't know the life cycle of a box elder bug. You might, but maybe these guys do better.
And actually, Mike's going to talk about that next week, but it is something that if you look, you will see the life cycle. This is the first year I've actually ever seen the nymphs, and they're really cool. They're actually really pretty.
Well, so they have
much
like
prettier
little
than the adults.
red bodies with
They're
legs.
almost completely red. Yes. And when they first start out, they just look like a little red ant or a mite or
Yes,
something.
yeah.
And then as they get bigger, they start to get more coloration in them. They really change their shape quite a bit in the season. It's pretty
And we have box elder trees around our house in Morrison, so all winter long we've got this just non-stop. Yeah.
Never ends.
Yeah. So here's our box elder tree. It's in the maple family. So these trees are dioecious, meaning there's some trees have female flowers and other trees have male flowers. So here's the female flowers, which are gonna make the fruit. These are the male flowers. The pollen is here. The wind blows. Pollen gets, stuck on the sticky stigmas. Then the sumaras form, which are the fruits.
Helicopters.
Yeah. Did you ever play with those when you were little? They're like two.
Just like a maple.
It's a sumara, yeah, like a maple tree. And then if you drop them, they spin. What was that? Almost 48 years ago when I was in kindergarten.
Still do.
Yeah.
It's something fun to do with the kids.
It
you
is.
know.
Yeah.
I love to play with that.
Do the trees look different than the flowers?
Yeah. Oh, you mean when they're not like when there's no flowers?
Yeah.
It gets tricky, but you can find remnants if you're good. Like even when we were out in late July, it was getting tricky. But they were still, you could see remnants of these dangly.
If you come out in the spring, you'll actually see the differences in the two trees, because it wasn't until last spring I finally could tell what she was talking about. Like, maybe there's two separate trees that are, one's male, one's female, and you will actually see them in a location not too far from each other, right where that concrete bathroom is.
Yeah.
And there's a male and there's a female. Check it out. So have the kids look and see if they can figure out which one's male, which one's female.
And sadly,
Hints.
I think there might be some kind of law in Denver that
You can't plant them. It's illegal. Yeah.
because of the bugs. Yeah.
Well, and they're considered a trash tree because they grow like weeds. They're not very manicured looking. So.
But they're super good for wildlife because the branches come down.
Yeah, like they can create habitat.
I was gonna say, you look at that one down there, the male female, the branches go like this, and it's very protective of the small birds.
Yeah, like the
Bugs have all the
towies.
time getting in there
The
after.
towies that are on the ground and need shelter and yeah. So, any other questions about box elders? They're moisture loving trees too. They like.
And you'll find the nymphs on the underside of the leaves. They're sucking the sap out of the leaves. They're sucking the sap.
Oh, by the way, was that box elder we were just talking about? Okay, now we're talking about hackberry, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So hackberry is one of my favorite trees. They typically have parasites, so you'll see these things all over the tree. So it's a parasite that gets in there, some kind of, who knows what, it's like mistletoe. And it can eventually do harm to the tree, but for the most part, it's mutualistic. Yeah, symbiotic relationship. And then there's galls associated too. I've got more for you to play with. Hang on. Emily wanted hands-on. Here. So these trees are in the elm family. Yeah. Can you see how the base of that leaf is lopsided, how that's higher and that comes down low? Can you guys see that? So that's a characteristic of a hackberry tree. So it's a lopsided, uneven base to the leaf. See how that's low and then that's up high? And then plus they get these little galls all over the leaves.
Kind of like witch's hazel galls.
Yeah,
Witch's hazel kind of has galls like this.
could be. I don't know what's witch's hazel. Is that
Witch
hazel?
hazel?
So,
I'm thinking of witch hazel, the front of
Is it
like
like
these
a,
that have the galls.
I think I used to eat that like in oil or something, wasn't it?
You could
Used to put it
used
for
to buy it as
massage.
I've used it as like an astringent.
Oh,
It
okay.
doesn't take easier.
But anyway, it's got these galls and, yeah.
After working that one.
So this tree grows from the plains up to the foothills. Likes it a little more moist, but you'll see it in dry areas too. And then this one was actually taken up in Moffett County, right coming out of the crack of a rock. So it kind of had that bonsai look going. It was just gorgeous.
Can we eat the berries on this?
Someone was saying they've eaten the
Yeah.
berries. Yeah, and I've seen birds
There's
eating the
a
berries.
pit in it.
Yeah.
Like they're mostly pit, but yeah, but you can, I went on a field trip in Boulder and, they said, oh yeah, you can eat them. And they said, oh, they're sweet one, and they did. I mean, the birds like them, and they are sweet. They're mostly pit.
And we have, it's weird, we have one right out in the garden of ashberries. And we
Hackberry?
have a hackberry right at the edge of the garden here.
Said someone planted or?
Yeah, something planted it.
Because Weber does talk about one species of hackberry that's not native. So, and I can't remember what the characteristic is, but they're all over red rocks. And I've seen birds eating berries like crazy in the fall.
Really interesting to see.
Yeah, and they blossom before the leaves come out. And then the leaves come out later, almost later than the cottonwoods. It takes a long time for these leaves to, watch it here on site and you'll see that it's,
So the blossoms come out first.
the blossoms come first and then the leaves. And it takes a while, it's like late May before those leaves ever emerge.
You can see.
Or, you
Yeah,
know,
we now have a
kind of.
collection of two larvae. If anybody wants to see them at the break.
These ones are big and black and juicy.
Nice description, Bird. Like you're a bird. You are a bird. There we go.
Did you find a bug in
She
there?
found
Yeah.
another one.
Cool, and it's
You're
actually
gonna bring
like
her with you.
moving.
It's big and black and juicy. I don't want to take it out so we can get it.
So I wonder if birds eat these things.
Well, what
You know,
I
like-
read is that birds will know what galls look like, and they'll go, or insects will know what galls look like, and they'll either eat the actual larvae or they'll eat the protein that's inside, so the larvae will not have anything.
So other insects predate.
Yeah,
For them.
yeah.
So the last thing we're gonna do are gymnosperms, and I can do these in like 5 minutes if you want.
Oh,
Oh, willows, yeah,
Yeah.
candy willow. So the willows are related to the cottonwoods, same family, and there's willow all over Chatfield. So anytime you have a river, a lake, any water, you've got willow, and there's probably at least 100 species of willow in Colorado. Willow are super difficult to key out because the keys typically require the fruit and the flower at the same time. So it makes it really hard. A lot of these keys are based on herbarium samples where they've collected both, and so you have both their press. So willows can be tricky, but coyote willow is one of the most common. It's all over Chatfield. Narrowleaf willow is another name for it, and willow is super important for bank stabilization, and again for birds. All kinds of birds depend on willow, like the willow flycatcher. And the southern willow flycatcher is a rare bird now, and there's a whole controversy because the tamarisk has been coming in, and now the bird is using the tamarisk. So the bird people don't want them taking the tamarisk out, which is a noxious weed, because the bird is now adapted to it, and it's a rare bird, so it's this big. There was a lawsuit. I mean, it's a big controversy. What else with willow? They're wind pollinated. They're usually dioecious, so there's usually 2 homes. The flowers aren't perfect. Anything else with willow? Probably there were uses with willow.
Is anybody here familiar with death?
That's good.
Aspirin. Oh my gosh. I chewed on a willow a year and a half ago. It
So
took my headache away.
Yeah, salicylic acid.
tall leaf
On the leaf or the?
That's in the bark.
in the bark.
It's in the bark.
It is the worst tasting, I was dying, it was so bitter. But my headache went away. It's crazy. So we don't necessarily have to go through conifers.
I think it would be good because we do have some on site.
Okay.
But I want people to be able to take a break from them, go to the bathroom, come check out the larva. This is really cool. We've never had anybody found the larva in there yet. So.
Step right up, it's only a nickel.
Yeah, so let's take a break and then we'll come back, about 7:30, we'll start back up again. Give them a little break. Yes.
Yeah, they're right.
Oh, really? Oh, we have some at the bottom. Let me give you a roll to put in there. Thank you for letting me know. We don't actually provide it, but I also have our library.
And then this is the black one.
It's not illegal.
Yeah, I was looking for something.
It's fine. There's stuff from the weekend too.
I think we might be dead. Yeah, and it's really don't worry. I put this in there.
You what?
I grew up in Oregon.
Oh, neat.
Not bad. I went to Winter Park last Wednesday, and I just brought a shop. And they also sometimes cook
They're usually flies or rocks.
Now, I'm working full-time here. So I've gone and done tons of field surveys, and now I'm breaking it all up. So I found lots of airplane, lots of probably in the area. Oh, yeah.
And then also,
Where is it? Okay. So kind of on the border. Yeah. Oh, it must be beautiful. Yeah, there's a lot of birds up there. Oh, yeah, they're people in water with viruses. Yeah. I should do that too.
Our cottonwood, oh, I was gonna say, they're cotton.
Oh, really? Wow. Yeah. We have cottonwood all around us in Morrison, but none right into there.
Here, I'll show you.
Oh, yeah, when the town's in solitary. Yeah.
Several hundred in our neighborhood.
I want to get a little aquarium and see which one's birth. The other one, I don't think so. I don't know, I lived on rocks and they're always like a little shape. And then last show, the larvae. This is the little larvae. Oh, it came out of the this guy. So there's a little black tick in there.
These are great.
Yes.
This is the I don't think it's got, the old one doesn't have color pictures,
Why do you like the old one versus the new one? How do you do it?
I prefer this, but she got like $2.
Oh, okay.
I know that's why the right one. Okay, got it. And I have this one over here.
Yeah. Tree and shrub, identification, like key out, all different kinds. Honeysuckle, nine-bar.
So you're an expert.
I don't know that I'm an expert.
It's fun though.
But it's fun.
I love the shrubs.
Yeah, I love the shrubs.
Because they're easier to key out, really. A lot of times don't have to need the flower.
Yeah, we did nine-bar, we did snowberry, we did, the blackberry, we did raspberry, we did raspberry. We did a lot. It was so fun. So now there's a group called the Curious Botanists on Meetup, and then they go out.
You should join. That'd be fun.
But we just go out and keep it.
Yeah.
So it just, they were, the last place they went was at North Table Pizza. They went out there and you can go connect with this. It's fun.
Her name is Kat Anderson, and if you just Google Kat Anderson, she's a PhD. She's like got a Davis Scholar. Looks to Davis. And she's also layers and all the she's a bit of a kindred spirit. And her love and enthusiasm for plants just got she was squishy there, back in my early 30s. I don't know, it's just so inspiring. It tasted like a wild
I mean, that's for all that. She might as well go all the way. Right, I mean, it's not like it's gonna live. There's something that's like fine over
Oh, yeah, there it is.
Yeah, she's got right to the south. They're pretty big in there. She's big. So she's PhD, so it's technical. But she has all kinds of her research was on Native American people and how her beliefs is that they enhanced the ecosystem by how they collected things. So when they collected bulbs, they collected in such a way that they left them out and come up. They knew, how they treated the lands.
Because this is their really
Yeah.
That's they didn't want to say the Donner Party, they didn't know that we're
Oh, probably, yeah.
Got it out.
I think that's the piece of learning about plants.
I know.
Yeah, how
Their relationship with people.
yeah.
That's cool.
I mean, I want to have a
Going out and identifying. You might have to wait also and know what they're.
Oh, I know, those kind of
How they treated them long
Go, right.
And it was happier that, the men were out hunting, the women were working with the plants. And they would pass it down, and teach.
You go.
They do that,
Yeah.
You don't, there's not as much of it here. I found more emphasis in California because there was still more people practicing collecting plants. It's a dying, our generations are
You're losing it from
Colorado maybe on the Butte Reservation. They keep pretty simple. There's not. I don't know about it. So it seemed like it came more large than it does here. I'm talking about just planting seeds in general.
So does the Patty still get classes that you have?
I don't know if she does. That was 1994. So
He's definitely.
probably youngster. But I think now she's working for the USDA, Department of Agriculture, and UC Davis. You know, so she's probably, I don't know if she's doing it.
Yep.
She's probably working with the
It was early. I think he's in shock. This one had a white one and a black one.
Yeah, that's easier for me. Well, it's harder, but it's easier than his recent ones.
Well, thank you. I actually call it
And I tell you something nice to do with these books. Never take it to the.
I want to tap into
Yeah, this all last night. So that when you're at it, it's not really relaxing. And honestly, all they heard.
see you bird.
Right?
Yeah.
And if you have it like this, it's
What?
yeah.
Oh, cool.
I've heard this last year. I did that.
Well, that's actually
Right?
I have, first.
It's like evergreen. I don't know what it is. I think Chinese are like a fruit. Yeah. And then
It's got a lot of that one.
that was my project now. Maybe I'll talk about it. You have your post in there.
Yeah.
It's a different Christmas.
You go up. I mean, in the
Jeffrey might drive it all up. Now, you're spicy.
It was so great to me. I mean, look at it, this kind was not very big. So look at how
Well, this is because the Jeffrey's grow very higher than the Ponderosa pine, at least over the Jeffrey's, because there's spines. Like the Ponderosa pine has spines and stuff. Yeah.
you can see these,
Right.
oh, yeah, it does. It lives on here. And that's just cool.
Just like, yeah, just because of age.
In a bract, like each of these is a bract, so that little wing thing sits in there. And the wing is for dispersal. It's gonna get blown on the wind, hopefully, but you'll see a lot of them right under the tree too. So that's been taping the whole time?
No, I just
Did you
turned it
forget?
back. I just turned it back on.
I thought we forgot that. All right, so. Ponderosa pine, so that is a classic foothills to lower montane. Sometimes you'll even see it in the upper montane. But typically, and you know, here, what's our elevation? You're about 6
Right here, about 6,000 feet.
About 6. So you are going to see some ponderosa pine here, but not as much as when you start moving up in elevation. And of course, Colorado, we have mountains, so there's many different zones of life. And here we're kind of between plains and foothills here. It's almost an ecotone, a transition zone. So you're going to get some ponderosa pine. What do I want to say about this? So, yeah, so let's go to the next slide. Yeah. All right, so pine trees have needles, which are their leaves, which you're kind of looking at there. That's getting passed around here. I'm afraid I'm going to like spread sap everywhere, but go ahead and just spread away, baby. Yeah, just watch out for the base there. That's where it's oozing out. It smells really good. And then I got some male cones here too, because these are the male cones. Those are male cones there. So. So everybody has a little bit of a ponderosa pine tree now that you're looking at. And what you have on one ponderosa pine, you've got female cones, and then you have male cones. So the female cones are the big cones that we typically think as a pine cone. And then the male cones those are getting passed around too. And you're seeing the male cones from last June, a year ago, so they're pretty used up and they're probably falling off.
So the males are the little fuzzy packagings.
Yep.
Okay.
And they produce the pollen. So then the pollen gets blown by the wind, and what you have, see, it takes a few years for a ponderosa pine cone to develop to get to the full size of some of these that are on the branches. That took 2 or 3 years to get that big. So this is probably a year old, and when they're really tiny, that's when they get pollinated. So when the wind blows in June, and there's pollen that's ready to go, and you see it, sometimes you'll see it blowing off trees, and what's your name? Dick. As he mentioned, you'll see it in ponds and puddles on the edges, and probably geologically they see pollen in rocks and sediments as well. It's an indicator of age oftentimes. So anyway, this is a young little cone that fell off probably prematurely. But the pollen gets into the cones, and then seeds develop. So there's no fruit that develops on a pine tree. It's just the seed. And it has this little scale, which is being passed around in that bowl, that will blow on the wind and get dispersed. So that's pretty much all pine trees. That's gymnosperms. That's how they behave. Now,
So in this sample, is that a baby pine cone in there?
could be. I think these are all male cones, but I don't know for sure. That could be a baby female developing.
Okay.
But I think the females are on different trees. Well, although not different trees, they're on the same tree.
Different
Yeah,
branches.
Same tree.
different branches. Yeah, and oftentimes the pollen is either lower. I think it's below. The male cones are below the female cones because the wind tends to blow up drafts.
Yeah.
So it's a way of getting that pollen into the.
When you get out in the spring and they're out like that, you see the gold on the lower branches.
And you can just touch a branch and it'll just
pop.
And
glow with
is it
gold.
like the other plants where a tree has to pollinate another tree's?
That's a good question.
Pollinate on the same tree.
I think that it's better if they cross-pollinate, but I think they still can pollinate on the same tree, but I don't know for sure.
Are they the same as this? Oh.
Does everybody see these 3 parts being passed around? Yeah. So you can see that on this ponderosa pine that grows right here. And so with pine trees, they have needles that come in bunches. So notice, somebody count the number of needles in a bunch. It should be 2 or 3.
2. These are all 2.
Okay, which is less common than 3. Typically ponderosa pine, if we were to key it out in this book, it would say 3, but I think he also says 2. You can have I happened to, this was up in Red Rocks, I stopped and grabbed it off a tree, and this Conifers pine has two needles in a bundle. So some pine trees have 5 needles in a bundle. The white pines have 5. Bristlecone pine has 5 in a bundle. And that's when you key out trees. Here's the Rocky Mountain Tree Finder. You really got to know how many needles are in the bundle. And also the length of the needles is pertinent. So bristlecone and limber pine have different lengths of needles. So all that kind of stuff. Let's go to the next one. So also the pine family is Douglas fir. It's another tree. We won't spend much time on this one because I don't have a sample, and I don't think there's a Douglas fir here at Chatfield. If you walked up Waterton and got up more into the foothills on the north-facing slopes, you're going to see Douglas fir. And they have those cones. They have the little mouse tails coming out of them. I know, it sounds crazy.
Somebody said that the mouse got trapped, the tiny legs and tail sticking out.
Yeah, well, there's all kinds, and these are Native American legends about the mouse girls were running from Coyote Man and jumped into the cones to hide. They were asking all the different trees where they could hide, and the pine tree, or the Douglas fir finally said, yeah, you can hide in my cones. And so all you see are the back legs and the tail sticking out. So next time you see a Douglas fir, check out the cones, and you'll see what I mean. It's just like the back end of a mouse. It's really funny. So. Well, there it is, actually. There are the cones.
Sorry.
You can kind of see it sticking out there. There's like a little tail and 2 legs. So,
It's a fun story to tell kids. We used to tell it all the time. We made up a story actually, and we would tell it to all the students at camp. They just thought it was the most awesome story. Ours was about actually mice who were bothering a coyote while they were sleeping, and then the coyote finally, like the 3rd time the mouse came, because it kept touching it. Like at first it touched its nose, and then it would touch its ears, and then it pulled its tail, and that's when it started chasing. The coyote started chasing the mouse, because it knew what was happening, and dove into the cone and hid, and got stuck there forever after. That's what we told the kids. And they remember that stuff. It's another way, as Scott says, bringing out a story, right, to get them involved and engaged, and you remember it. And every time I see a cone, I know if it's a dead fern.
I know, me too. I
might not know what other cones are out there, but I know that
see
one.
the little mouse girls in there.
That's right. Yep.
Yeah.
I owned a commercial pistachio grove in southeastern Arizona for several years. And typically you have an on year and an off year. A heavy produce year followed by very light produce, about 40% of the heavy year. And that's typical of nut trees and many fruit trees. Is it typical of conifers?
I'm going to say yes.
I think
yeah,
it is.
I think it goes in
Cycles.
Yeah.
In the Northwest, the Doug firs
Yeah.
will go through those. Some years they'll just be loaded.
And probably then the chicories, the red squirrels that are associated with, or whatever squirrels eat these, you know, the fruit, or not the fruit, the seeds, probably have like go up in them too. You know, it's a good point.
It's a really good point. Thank you.
All right, so blue spruce trees. I don't think there's any at Chatfield, unless they've been planted.
Yeah, I don't.
It's the state.
Yeah, we do have a spruce right out here.
Okay, it's a Colorado state tree, probably was planted. And I've got blue spruce, and it's super prickly. This was growing red in Morrison. This is really common to plant these. But see these little things? It looks like a cone. It's a blue spruce gall, not a gall. Yeah. So this is classic. When you see these things, well, actually, it's this one right here. I don't know, maybe a cone. I'm sorry. It's this one. See that little funny brown thing with all the lawn? It's not a cone, it's a gall. There's a critter in
So
there.
spruce budwood
It's a, ask the entomologist next
We
week.
have those
Just
out in the
keep
tree.
this. We should keep
Okay.
this.
Wait until on spruce and Douglas fir.
If you want.
Just grab hold of
It's
the branch.
really prickly. Sorry.
Do you want these back?
You can
I'll
crush
just-
a Douglas
Oh,
fir,
okay.
it's soft. The
Right.
spruce tree will feel like you got a handful of meat.
Yeah, it
I mean,
hurts.
literally, they really do hurt.
Yeah, so you can see the galls on there. And that's classic because it's sometimes hard to tell an Engelmann spruce, which grow up higher in elevation, from a blue spruce. So the blue spruce have longer cones. Engelmann spruce cones will be about 2/3 that
So
length.
that's probably what we have out there though, because we have a spruce and it's like the cones are about that big.
It was short?
Yeah.
It's probably Engelmann then. Yeah, I don't know for sure, but if you see those weird galls on it, then it's a blue spruce. And blue spruce have a blue color often. They grow at lower elevations than Engelmann spruce, and the cones are longer on blue spruce. And I have a weird way of remembering that, but,
You said the blue spruce have a longer cone?
yeah. They have a shorter name and a longer cone. So Engelmann has a longer name and a shorter cone. That's how I remember it. It's kind of like a little bit. But you can see the galls in that picture too.
Oh, yeah. So there's a
They've got long things coming out. So, what did you say, it's a blue spruce budworm or
I think
something?
it's a spruce budworm.
Okay.
It gets into the bud, and that's what, those are.
Oh, okay, and then it
They do that real
develops.
soft green. It's a softer green than the rest of it when they leaf out.
I found the larvae
Worms
in it.
Did you?
I did.
That's the spruce
She must be.
budworm. She's into it.
She's our entomologist.
That's fantastic.
It's a gelatinous blob of peach-like goo. With
And it's
little
like moving.
hairs. It's,
It's nasty.
oh yeah, he did it! Oh my goodness, yay!
Kind of native larvae. Who knew?
I knew when I was picking these galls, I'm like, oh God.
So that's really great because I did not know that that was a gall. I thought that that was actually a cone
It's how
developing.
I ID the trees out in the wild. So I often have to say, is this Engelmann or is it blue spruce? And there's other characteristics, but that gives it away every time. Oh, blue spruce.
Alrighty.
Okay, invasive. Do you want to do invasives or no? We can not.
Let's just mention them really quickly
Okay.
because it is something that we do.
Yeah.
Let's see what we got.
So invasive plants are basically plants out of place. So these are plants that are not native to this area. Many of these plants that are native to this area have been here for literally hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of years. So these things came from another place. So there's weeds and there's noxious weeds. Weeds aren't so bad. There's tons of weeds, tons of things that have come from Europe, from Asia, from Africa. But noxious weeds are bad. And so they're doing all kinds of bad things. All these things can get into our drinking water supply, threaten agricultural crops, pasture land, native habitat. Puncture vine. Everybody know what puncture vine is? That nasty thing? It's a tribulus plant is the genus name of it, and it has these spikes on the fruits. So it punctures your tires if you go over it on a bike. They're native in the Galapagos.
Go ahead.
Goat heads.
Go ahead.
That's it.
Go ahead, it's puncture vines. Sorry.
What was you saying?
It's goat heads. The thing's called goat heads. So they're all over the Highland Canal Trail and all over the trails through Chatfield.
And it's a noxious weed. So noxious weeds are people in the state that specialize in this stuff. They say, okay, there's an A list, a B list, and a C list. And the A-listers are the worst offenders. They're typically ones that haven't quite gotten here yet, like that are really bad, say in California or Nevada, and they're starting to get here. And it's an A-list weed, and if you see it, it's like, oh God, we gotta control it before it gets bad. So then the B-listers, like goathead, I think that's a B list, it could be a C list. I meant to bring my weed book. I've got a website though, that website is what you want to go to for noxious for weeds. And it'll give you the A list, the B list, and the C list, and it changes every year. So, anyway.
You brought a weed with me too that you said was not good.
All of us are responsible for, in our yards, if we've got listed noxious weeds, we're responsible. They can come to you and say, knock on your door and say, you've got to get rid of those toadflax. So, that's kind of it in a nutshell.
And this is one that right now we're doing a project with Kent Denver, and they're coming out quarterly to help us remove. I don't know if Russian thistle, is that a noxious or is that just a weed?
It's not on the list,
Not on the
but it's everywhere. It's
So
Colorado.
how did you say they mainly get here?
They get, so over half of them have gotten here through horticultural transport. So, whoa, this is pretty, let's plant this. Like, go to the next slide, there's a picture of it.
Toad flags.
Yeah, toad flags or butterniggs, it's,
Similar to a native plant.
yeah, it is.
Native
It's,
is
it
very
looks,
similar to that.
the plant itself looks a lot like a penstemon.
Yeah.
Um,
Rich
So,
purple leaves.
it's beautiful.
And it's bad because why?
Because they're taking over croplands, they're aggressive. They didn't arrive here with their predators. So it's not like it came along with the yucca moth, you know? So there's nothing to keep it in check. So they have a competitive edge, and they take over, and you'll see if you hike in places like up Highway 74 above Morrison, there will be fields of butter and eggs and nothing else. So it's scary. It's like they're encroaching on all of our native, diverse habitat. Yeah, it's, yeah.
The roots are very, very tenacious. Rooty,
With this one,
and then
yeah.
they spread underneath, like almost like rhizomes. We had the misfortune of planting one in our yard, and we're still digging the damn thing out.
Yeah.
And we have some here. We also on the big day, which is our community service / Earth Day, we do a lot of noxious weed removal here as well. And we do have some out actually by the parking lot. It's in this front area right here. Yep. So it's definitely.
Yeah, the lot down on the bottom of the trail.
Yeah, and the lot down there
So
too.
mullein is a weed, it is on the list, it's either a B or a C. But there's tons of uses with mullein, with the native people did with mullein. But it is a noxious, it's considered a noxious weed. I think it's on the C list.
And mulleин's a tricky one. This is one that, this is where it becomes a difficult thing sometimes to talk about with kids and understanding. So like, it's pretty easy for us to understand salt cedar or tamarisk and why that is a weed and a non-native species that is harmful to us because it takes so much water. So tamarisk usually end up growing where cottonwoods grow, and they suck a ton of water up out of the ground. Now they're providing habitat, which again is starting to make it tricky. Mullein is the same thing. Mullein is not native, but finches love it, and they love to eat the seeds. And so we see, I have watched right out here mullein growing up in our gardens, and they're just sitting on there eating the seeds out of the top. So it becomes a tricky thing because it's like, well, it's not supposed to be here, and the animals are.
And anybody that's a
Adapt.
butterfly person, the
Butterflies.
thistles, the Canada thistle are food for many butterflies. So the people that love butterflies are like, don't get rid of those Canada thistles. You know, it's just.
They're really deadly in pastures because they get so thick and nothing.
Yeah. So and all, the ones I showed you are all here. You've got two types of knapweed. I have actually a whole list of plants that I saw here, but I put too many.
And we have a whole actual binder that we've made that has all the noxious weeds in it that we do removals when we do the big day and when Kent and Denver comes, and it has pictures of each of them so that you can remember what they are.
There's three types of knapweed, and I
we have a lot.
think we got two types. There's diffuse Russian and purple, I think, or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's Canada thistle. So the very next one is.
Is there a big difference between the Canada thistle and what I'm used to in farther south, the Russian thistle?
They're similar looking. Can you, I don't know for sure. I see
Same
have Russian
purple.
thistle here.
We have-
Purple flower?
So we have a couple of different types. We have a bull thistle here, and we have a musk thistle as well. And then we have the Canada one that she's talking about. And then I can't remember, we also have the Russian thistle as well.
Russian thistle's in a different family entirely.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
And so one of this thistle, I can't remember which thistle it is that's actually native, because we have a native one too. So generally speaking, because they spread so quickly because of how many seeds they have in pod, we'll remove them because they will come back. I mean, it's not like in removing them, we're never going to have the thistle again here, because that's just not realistic. There's no way we can get our thistle population under control unless we had a team of people who are out here all the time removing thistle. To us to take out the ones that we can, because there will be so many more that actually crop up.
And with the annuals, you can just take the heads off,
Yeah.
whereas with the perennials, they'll come back, so you gotta get them by the roots or spray them.
Right.
or something.
So we usually dig them out. All of the thistles we'll actually dig them out and take them out that way. But and that's again, it's one of those things where it's not a simple, easy answer of how bad are non-natives or the invasive weeds, because there's always some sort of positive benefit. It seems like as well. But I know one of the things that was easier for me to see in Arizona with the non-natives, we had this grass called buffalo grass, and it was actually taking over Sonoran Desert habitat. It was not a native grass. It was a grass that was growing there because it had been brought in by the Forest Service to control some erosion because of something else that they did when they did a bunch of grazing and deforestation, and then it ended up somehow coming, of course, into the desert, and it was taking over all the cactus habitat and was literally choking out Nichols Turk's head, which are now a threatened and endangered species of cactus. So in the Sonoran Desert, it's a lot easier to see. Here, it's trickier because we have such a diverse group of plants. You don't always see it happening right away. But when she was talking about these fields of toadflax, it'd be like imagining if you had only toadflax and there was no blue grama growing there, all the insects and the plants, or all the insects and the birds and everything else that depends on that grama now has no place to live. So it's, you know, does it diversify over time? Next week, Mike Weissman will be telling you about his philosophy on invasives and other things and change, because what do we know about the biological world in general? How does it work? Over time, if you think about it in geologic time, what do we know happens? Evolution, right? And mutation and change over and over. Chaos is what nature is based off of, right? So we constantly have change. Humans, however, get very attached to things looking a certain way. We always want it to look a certain way. We want our ponderosa pine forest to look like pine forest. We want our shortgrass prairie to look like shortgrass prairie, long grass, you know, tall grass prairies. And so, is there any way to stop it? I mean, not with how much we're becoming international. It's going to be really, really tricky. And there are benefits and disadvantages to both.
And the big money behind getting rid of weeds is really because weeds are invading our agricultural crops and getting in the way of our cattle. So that's the leverage to put money into getting rid of weeds. There's not much money in getting rid of weeds for a native habitat. So
most of them get their start in disturbed areas.
Yep, that's true. They do better in disturbed.
Road cuts.
Yeah.
Any disturbed soil.
Anything that's disturbed, that's one of the first places they take hold, and then they begin. And this is why there's so many you were talking about. You tell the overgrazing.
Yeah.
That's disturbed the natural and opens it up to these invasive species.
Hey,
Go ahead.
I was just going to mention too, this is a different subject, but I did put the juniper too have little berries. They're not berries though, they're pine cones, and those are those little blue things. So those are the female cones of the juniper trees.
Oh.
Yeah, just so you know. And then the male cones are right here.
I want to see what the
You need a hand ones because
do you?
they're tiny, right? They're still developing.
Oh, okay. Oh,
So I didn't mean to get you off.
no, and actually that's a really good point, because one thing that I learned about, since I'm not as familiar with what all the birds eat in this area, Townsend solitaire actually eat the cone on a juniper.
Yeah, they're dependent on them.
Yeah.
This is the male.
This is the male. Yeah, juniper. Up
And the a lot of American robins have started wintering in this area, and they will hunt for these the junipers, the ornamental junipers you put out. And when they find one, they will spend a week in the tree and literally clean it. There won't be any berries left on it.
Wow.
Yeah, and that's hard on the Townsend solitaire because that's their typical. And then the Townsend solitaire go up high to nest in the summertime, in the spring and summer. And they come down here. That first sound of the Townsend solitaire you hear like in October, it's always exciting because it's like, oh, they're back. And the males are getting their habitat where they're guarding their trees. And I haven't seen that many robins this year, but last year there were hundreds of robins. Yeah. So I'm tired and ready for bed.
Well, you can't give up yet. This is the most exciting.
Can you guys do the rest?
Yay. Okay, so one of the next things that we're going to do, and I will need you briefly to be doing the keys here. We have a bunch of different plants that Christina and I collected this fall for you guys. We were thinking ahead. We actually did it ahead of time, which is impressive for us. And we're going to be giving you guys each a couple of different samples. I would encourage you to work in pairs just because it's more fun, but if you want to do it by yourself, I'm not going to tell you not to. I would think what might be easiest is to have
So that's not going to be a struggle.
No, that's not going to be a struggle.
But I know what it is.
Okay. We can talk. Somebody could still try to figure it out though. We've had other folks here who make videos. questions.
Yeah.
We have a number of different things here that we'd like you to try to ID.
Take some.
Yep, we can start passing them around. And some of these we just saw, and we'd like to give you guys the opportunity to actually try to figure it out. So we pass these around. And maybe what you could do, why don't I pass around? Do you want to start writing down what are some basic things we can start to figure out how to key things? What are some basic keying techniques?
Sure.
How do you know about if you didn't know anything? Like
It's actually pretty good.
Well, are you guys going to do together? Did you want
Yeah.
to do it?
I don't even know where to start.
Do you guys want me to first talk about how to use that key?
Yeah, that would be helpful.
Okay, I can do that. The only problem is I have the new book. You guys have old books. So, okay, so if you've never used a key before, the way they work is you want to start from the very beginning. And in your books, can I borrow one of yours?
Give me something else.
It's like an extra book.
Key one is key springs.
Pretty good. Okay. So some people are pretty good at this. Like you've keyed. Has anybody else keyed before? So you're all pretty new. Like if you're pretty good at it, you can help the other folks. But a dichotomous key is just that. It's two characteristics. So you start in the beginning and you say yes. Whoa, it's snowing.
It's definitely snowing.
Okay.
What do you mean?
Look at that snow. It's like the size of
Yes, it is.
head.
So what you'll see is, okay, I got this trouble. This is how it was when I taught 8th grade. I don't this is the style. So it's like they totally could just run me over. They had tons of fun, but I didn't even get long.
Carol, if you tell me some of the things, I can write it down for you.
Okay, so dichotomous keys, so you're going to begin right in the beginning. And for this one, it says, yeah, it starts with woody plants. So number one is, so you're going to have a one there, and there'll be another one. So let's turn the page. And it says woody plants with broad leaves. Or woody plants with evergreen. So right there, I'm thinking, they're talking about gymnosperms. So this would be, this first page is going to be like a pine tree. And then the second page, it looks like it's going to go to angiosperms. So any woody plant, because there's a lot of flowering plants that have woody plants with broad leaves. So then that takes you to flowering plants. I don't know what else to say.
Sometimes like it'll say like leaves opposite or
Yeah.
leaves alternate.
Right,
So
that's a huge thing with shrubs.
so-
That's a good point.
And so then they'll say go to, if they're opposite, then go to this.
Yeah.
There's usually going to be, what like the opposite is going to be, what is it, the magpie horse. That's maple, ash. Okay.
So Emily, oftentimes with shrubs, it's opposite or alternate branches. So it's a not or.
But it's confusing because there's no leaves on this side.
And then it's typically from there, you could go in. So if it's opposite or alternate, you might not leave the shape of the leaf. So either the leaf is simple.
Okay, hold on a second.
Or it's compound. It sounds like they're going to go into roads.
Okay.
Carol,
Yeah.
quick question for you.
What's it at? Leaves low, leaves not low. Okay, so, not low. Yeah, that's a simple leaf. So,
When it goes to 7,
wait to see.
was 7. Seven.
Oh, it's 7 this year.
Yeah. So this,
So, and like, last summer, I found this one. And it is a baby ant nursery. And they were being born butt first. And so the whole story, so it was invisible. Summer. Yeah, so I shot it. And there were like adult ants, but kind of like almost creepy. Like, some were like little baby ones. They had like the adults hang out the top of their and the ladybugs the mosquito nursery has that. And then
You should watch it. It's not weird. I love it as a and the ants were sure you love it. There's some crazy stuff happening. And they can grab it.
Okay, so this says here now. Okay, so no, you're good. Oh, no, actually, you're good.
where do you live?
Still have snow tires on. Yeah, so that's what makes the creepy, because it's not, the stem is opposite. And I think the answer to this is, I think it's 33, try 33. Sometimes you can just go forward. Oh, so what we get. Sometimes just play with it.
46,000 feet.
I did something wrong.
I know, we got
The other thing you can do is really great is go backwards. Do you know what that is?
You guess
So try to do that, and then see if it makes sense going forward to find where it's way back. Usually what I do is I make sure I know like exactly what I'm looking at, so that
it's interesting because these side by side.
Yeah, what's it? I mean, messed up.
especially with
So we better got the sugar rush or something. Okay, first of all, these are flowers. Is this a narrow leaf?
So it's in the road. That's not gonna be in this version. But this one's still.
Yeah, we got that.
I made bigger.
Yeah. That will be the plain Scotch. No wonder it's Alright, so what? Let's go first. Brush. So we just plant green
Well, no, because that would give away immediately. Yeah, must be on your part of it. Well, maybe it's just figure it out. It's hard,
Is that opposite? I mean, that looks opposite to
Yeah, and we have a lot of this on property. That's all the time.
So it's like, so how consistent is it?
Right.
And this tells you where to
Go
go.
to 4.
And then you go down there to 4. Right. And then you go down to 2. And then I kind of have the
So basically, so what's the type of simplest called a system method where you just break it all down to the ones that
So how would you guys
like, because it always takes back up.
So you guys have to write
so like,
So I think the
you
thing
say
is,
it's either this one or this one.
Right.
Either this one or this one.
So this is what you go to 4. So we're trying to
Right, to this one.
This is simple.
and you have to, and that's my yeah. Then it's like, well, I
Okay, so leaves, alternate, and then there's simple.
Opposite leaves. When you see an apple tree, they're opposite.
She said it's
we're saying non-low.
Oh,
yeah.
Dogwood.
That's the right
I don't have out here.
That one I think pretty sure we had that one. We might be a non-native. And again, it's hard to
So there's not that.
One side
There's
is
just
number
that
that
right
right there.
opposite.
These are like huge.
And this, and that.
Not well. Okay, so it's just 28, there's only, okay, so it's either or tree and go to 30. That's all of it. Margins of all or most of these books. They have right, and you're right, number 86.
So everyone already gets that.
Stems are best with horns, or with or without spines. No, it's hard. Like
Well, let's talk about the
okay, these
I think with that one,
more stems.
and if it's not a native, then
That's not a stem. What's this thing?
That's part of the leaf.
That's part of the leaf.
go backwards.
Isn't this the twig?
I do it all the time.
And that's not a twig?
I don't know what it is.
Okay, well, it's either,
This was a twig.
it's either 30 centimeters or more or less.
Well,
Yes.
30 centimeters, almost 30 centimeters.
So, where are we?
Now these are.
How many centimeters are in it?
This may be in.
Okay.
so that's.
Yeah, I'd say we're right in the middle.
And this really, this is called different.
Okay.
And I'm going to say based off of this.
More like a shrub.
Okay, so now meters, tall or more or less.
It's a nice
One or two.
Right.
So over
What do you use? Or flattened?
Or somebody.
Or not? Leaf base don't have a leaf. Are the leaves wider than long? It is.
They're wider than long.
You know that thing that was our area has white.
Yeah,
But a good thing for,
It's ultimate.
But
Well, the deltoid goes, I would say deltoid, right? Because your deltoid muscle is
Is that
this
how that
thing.
thing?
And it comes down.
Yeah, it's not good.
Yeah, and you just leave that over your shoulder, that's the deltoid muscle. It's a deltoid. It's deltoid.
Yeah. And that number here.
Sure.
It is kind of hard.
Creeping out.
This is the rock.
And you know,
Yeah.
Okay, well, we're not.
Okay.
Look, we're all by one.
All right, so, you know, it's,
Yeah, so wait, where are your own? So we messed it up.
so,
Yeah. Like in the 80s something, 86 I thought.
all of these.
Right. Okay, so steps to taking us to next 3.
So here's your one and your one, those are your two choices.
Yeah, we messed
So
up.
we plants with deciduous
Anyway.
variety.
there you go.
We're getting there.
Now we have an idea.
These sequins, they have
Okay,
there,
this is a house.
or these,
I didn't realize.
these are deciduous grosbeak, versus anything, if they were out in wild, I would have seen
That's, you know, and they have.
So they're calling that.
So,
That's opposite.
this has everything you know, so you go to the first one. So you
This is the kind of setup.
So we're in the difference between you.
Yeah.
There's a.
Okay, so
About the plants.
so we've got,
Then it is just by the picture book.
Yeah, the picture book.
see that multiple.
You know what I'm saying?
No, I know what I'm saying. But the key is you need to see.
It's like the tools. These are the tools of identifying. And then the That's more the scientific way.
Yeah. What are they? Are they?
Right.
It is, this is a
Yes.
There's keys like tell you what all this is.
I'm gonna write this down to make my next little investment. Where are we? So this would be easier.
This is honestly easier to use because there's not that many steps. You can make progress.
And then it talks about the sand. So, you know, this is pretty much.
Yeah, I'm not gonna ever get it.
Oh, now it's
So what we need is nobody home with us.
And I have a key
So Emily, do you want these done? After we're done? In the little thing? Actually, you guys can trade if you want another group to try to figure it out. So there's one down here, for example, so try another one. Okay.
So this is almost like, right, so this is also like her birthday that you teach, sort of, the one, the good ones that have the shapes.
Yeah.
Kind of, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sort of. But this is like.
Trees and shrubs. Well, here, here you go.
So these are the tree branches. And they have,
It's the